So patriarchy combined with fundamental religious belief is the most toxic combination for women rights in the country. Not just Afghanistan, probably in the entire world. But I go more with patriarchy than religious fundamental belief. So I have one thing to say to patriarchy then. Actually, we have. Fuck patriarchy. Fuck patriarchy. But fuck patriarchy is not my wisdom, unfortunately. It's my friend Virginia. She's not Virginia Woolf, Virginia. So that wisdom I learned from her. So fuck patriarchy and keep telling that. And she has, I can see that, a t-shirt wearing shoes. So what can you do about, like the least we can do about women's rights in Afghanistan? The least thing that we can do is, I read an article a few years ago on 8 March by Melinda Gates on International Women's Day. She was arguing that the least thing that we can do is just talk about it, talk out in our circle, talk in our peers and in our jobs and our family, because changes happens with one conversation at a time. So talk about it, do not forget about them, because they're already invisible in public and they are getting more invisible. So please do not forget about them and share their stories. Most important, use your platform, use your voice, whatever you can do, just share it. Share their stories, a story of a teenage mom at second grade of school and her daughter at first grade of school. So tonight I'm going to finish my speech with a poem by Rumi. Rumi is a 13th century Persian writer. He is probably the most famous person in history of Afghanistan. And Persian speakers are always somehow involved in every time. If they want to prove something, they just bring poetry. So this poetry is called You and I. Literal meaning of the poetry is the romantic love between two people. But it's unself love or unconditional love or love without ego. But it depends on my mood. This poem has been different for me. Like it's more about, when I read this, about freedom. It's more about choice. It's about choice of kissing your loved one on your porch or your veranda or at your doorsteps, at their doorsteps, or on the street without the feeling of being prosecuted or imprisonment, or the choice of like going after like very, very basic right of yours, which is education or school. I'm going to recite the poem in Persian, and the meaning is, so you can read it. What is the meaning? I hope you can see it from there. It's called You and I, and in Persian it's called Manutu. خنک آندم که نشینیم در ایوان من تو بدو نقش بدو صورت و یکی جان من تو داد باغ و دم مرغان بدهد آب حیات آن زمانی که درآییم به بستان من تو اختران فلک آیند به نظاره ما می خود را بنماییم به نشان من تو من و تو بی من و تو جمع شویم از سر زاو من و تو بی من و تو جمع شویم از سر زاو خوش و فارغ ز خرافات پریشان من تو طوطیان فلکی جمله شکرخوار شوند در مقامی که بخندیم برانسان من و تو این عجبتر که من و تو به یکی کنج اینجا هم در این دم به عراق ما خراسان من و تو به یکی نقش بر این خاک و برم نقشی دگر بهشتی هبدی و شکرستان من تو خنک آندم که نشینه در ایوان من تو خوش و فارغ ز خرافات پریشان من تو. Thank you so much.
So at this moment, if you would like to pose some questions or get some deeper insight, now's your time to interact. So anybody want to discuss or ask any questions to Fagula? Out the back there.
So, I'm from Iran. I know how things are going in Afghanistan. I'm very familiar. So, like, the same situation is in Iran, but like in Iran, right now, people are protesting, even though the government is killing them. The minute they killed a woman for a job, people came out, men. But I wonder, why in Afghanistan, the situation is even worse. Why men are not supporting women? Why the women are in houses? Everything is like, I mean, you should protest. No matter they kill people, you should protest. I don't know why in Afghanistan it's not the case. In Iran, people are being killed. I'm worried about my family. My mother was in protest, they were shooting her. But like, they don't care because if you are not free, why would you be? So why men are in Afghanistan? Why do you expect the whole world to support you? The whole world is not going to support you, never. They don't care. Even though they have organizations, they don't know what it's like to be there, the fear. I know. You should do something, you yourself, accountable. I have friends from Afghanistan in Iran. I love them, but I don't know why you're not supporting them. But why? That's my question.
Thank you so much. I completely agree with that. Right now in Afghanistan, the protests happening or in Iran, both of them are led by women. And it's the brave women that are fighting with Taliban here, and in Iran also the women on the street are fighting for that. Unfortunately, I am not in Afghanistan, but I will also be like fighting with them or going to the forefront and protesting. But I can tell you the reason why probably might be why men are not supporting women. It's back to my research, like the way I talk. Sometimes it's not a fundamental religious belief that are against women's rights. It's the patriarchy that exists in Afghanistan and women that is against the women's rights. So somehow, if they are not supporting, they are supporting the patriarchy. So it is patriarchy, and that's more a big problem for them.
Yeah, but if you want to stop, men should come out.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with that.
One question over there.
So why does the Taliban interpret the Sharia law differently compared to other Muslim countries? Why is it they have specific quotas in the whole Sharia law?
I think it comes to power and controlling people, like easy as that. So they put their own vision, and they know that the people, and they know how to control them, especially in the rural part of the country when there's no education in the school. So it comes to power and controlling people. It's simple, really. I think it's my vision. Some people have different opinion about it.
Any other questions?
Well, how the international community didn't solve the problem in the 20 years they were there? What did they do wrong? What should they have done?
It's very complicated topic. I think there needs to be more research than why international intervention or international community failed miserably badly in Afghanistan. I live in a village area, so sometimes I feel like the people at the top was not representing those people at the rural part of the country. So they came with their own vision of liberalization of area, which first they thought that money would solve everything, and then they brought, I give an example, like I was in the village and then every per people was supposed to have, every family has supposed to have $200 to fix their village or do something great. And somehow this idea came, I don't know from where, that this $200 we need solar panel. Like every house can have a solar panel. And they bought solar panel, and in one, like every house, like that was probably all over $100 millions, $100 millions of dollars, but in 1 month the solar panel got failed because it was cheap, the corruption was there, and then it was, I don't know, like that was the most cheapest one they brought to the people. And when I heard, like later I was watching a TikTok, and the person in charge of that is still talking about this great, great innovation in Afghanistan that he did was bringing solar panel to the country. And he still wrote a book about it. And he didn't know, like after 1 month the solar panel is gone. So that's how, probably that's an example of how they failed in Afghanistan.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. At the back there.
How do you see the situation going forward? We had this 20-year, to the lack of a better word, experiment in Afghanistan. Do you think that there's going to be a foreign intervention? Do you think that Afghan people will be able to change the government slowly, gradually, to order revolution? What do you think?
But I was like in my friend group, everyone called me always the optimistic person, but right now I have zero optimism about Afghanistan's future currently. And probably nobody knows it now. They're in control, they have billions of dollars of instrument like they could use against people, and they have everything to control Afghanistan. So future, I don't know, it seems very blurry to me, very blurry. I think I can now see what is coming, and nobody can see it now, probably.
Everyone, give Fakhra a wonderful round of applause for this beautiful insight. Okay, we're going to take just a quick break and set up for the next talk. Please use this time to ruminate, decompress, get some food, get some drink, and we'll be back on in about 5-10 minutes. Thanks very much.
Can I have an axe? Can I have an axe?
in my bio that I'm also a part-time rap star. I wrote a little rap for tonight. Would you guys like to hear it before I get into the topic? Since we're all eating, my roommate belched, an act he could not help, and out across the table atop a silver salt shaker sat his breaded veal, just a sliver of the meal, half digested, rested for everyone to see. His girlfriend shrieked, I could not speak, but out came more uncontrolled like chocolate milk and poured across his tray, with bits of stuffing and gravy then nothing, but nicely formed like puddles on his plate, when suddenly there, impelling from his chin, he appeared to salivate. And eyelids at half-mast, he seemed to barely utter, though straining, I surmise his request was for the butter. I grew up in the 1970s. I heard one of my relatives war stories. World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And when I was growing up, I thought that I would probably die in war. I was deathly afraid of the Soviet Union. We used to have drills almost once a month in school. It was get under the desk drill. Maybe you remember that one? So after I graduated college, I went into the military because I was under a mountain of debt. And my first assignment was in Panama. And I don't know if you know about Panama. In '89, we invaded. And I haven't been right since. I haven't been able to erase a lot of the memories of Panama. So I was kind of, after I left the military, I was interested in PTSD. I tried to self-medicate for many years with like whiskey and rum and so forth. Trying to self-medicate with whiskey and rum and margaritas and whatnot. I got hired, started teaching with Maryland, and I thought maybe, the whiskey's not doing very good for me, and I thought I might try to figure out on my own why I can't erase the memories. And so I went into psychology and linguistics, and I thought there might be a fruitful way to do research and understand the psychological processes of language, how we process language, how we develop language, and so forth. So that has brought me to my present research, and what I do study is systems of lies, deceit, and lying, and how the signs and symbols today, how they sort of trigger our emotions as consumers of news, as participants in the public discourse. So let me just begin with my talk. I'm sorry I have it scripted. I gave a version of this talk on Tuesday night for an organization called PANDA, Pandemics, Data and Analytics, and it's in the UK. You can check it out. I think the talk it'll be posted on here pretty soon. It was 5,000 words, and I had to boil it down to a couple of thousand. So when I was a boy, I became really interested in the structuring of the world and the sounds and the symbols and what they meant. I'd often wonder as I mindlessly standing in class reciting a pledge to a flag, I didn't quite know the deeper meanings of. I couldn't quite grasp. It's clear now in this highly mediated world that the signs, symbols, and have only become more pervasive and insidious, effectively camouflaging the forms of deception and the controlled demolition of identities, societies, and biological life, and their attempted restructuring and the image of the powerful. I ask questions about how perception and thought, how they're structured, and the composition of perception and thought. So as a linguist, I suppose that if language is the fundamental base upon which we structure our understanding of what we perceive to be true, not true, valuable, and not valuable, what we observe in our studies, under the microscope maybe, or in the public discourse, then what does the present structure and content of the social world say about us as citizens, as consumers of news, products, as human beings, emotional creatures gifted with consciousness by God eternal? This talk is partly meant to motivate more careful considerations of how people in power speak today, how they structure their own perceptions of us, about the claimed necessity of subjecting all of us to all forms of untested pharmaceutical updates and injections pitched by technocratic stakeholder salesmen as befitting the public good. The language we use, I argue, is really at the center of what's going on. It is the words themselves that are the depleted uranium of meaning, dense with the intentions of the revealed heart of a person. I think this makes sense in this insane world, especially today, where we see leaders mandating that citizens, in the US, for example, be officially classified as lab rats, to be subjected to all manner of transhumanist updates and genetic interventions in the name of progress toward a new future for humanity. The subtext of the 2022 executive order is really just the text of the white papers and presentations obscured by scientific jargon used decades ago by the agencies funded to work out the technical transformations of societies and people. So one thing seems clear. We are in a new kind of warfare, unconventional, and the weapons are as abundant as the air we breathe, much more sophisticated than those of yesteryear. They're threats we don't see, especially today when we need electron microscopes to observe them working. Now, they don't necessarily appear as dropped bombs, fired bullets, coerced injections, but as mass communicated words and phrases and slogans and mantras meant to restructure our understanding of who we are as sovereign beings with natural immune systems. PR professionals know simple repetition promotes fluent cognitive processing, since these representations are perceived to be more real and more accurate than those that are more nuanced and complex. So we hear today the fluent mantras that echo the horrors of the past and cause us to experience the illusion of truth. This, according to experimental psychologists, is a primary approach for liars, tricking and bamboozling rapt audiences. When they tested out this theory of purposeful repetition, they discovered that participants in the experimental group neglected knowledge stored in long-term memory and attended rather to new representations of fluent processing. This feature of human cognition seems likely one reason why the Third Reich, during the Third Reich, the representation of Jews as social infestation led to the atrocities that history shows. The pervasive and ever-repeated propaganda messaging reinforced the concept that an ethnic group were a dangerous vector for disease spread. Today, the ethnic lines are drawn around everyone. Let's consider for a moment the structuring of the social, economic, and political world around us. The structure itself implies an owner. a designer of inequities that go unaddressed and left to linger. A new one, a managed existence of unfairness, imbalance, and injustice. So, I wonder, to what extent can we study public discourse and understand it as a much larger experiment in which dominant social, political, and economic forces shape perception and influence our opinions? So, the question is, how did we arrive at this intersection of this bizarre moment in history? We can find hints at it 100 years ago in Edward Bernays' propaganda. As a nephew of Sigmund Freud, Bernays was fascinated by his famous uncle's theories of human desire and behavior and sought to apply them to the propagation of concepts and products made palatable for consumers. You can see in the book the managers of modern societies claiming to abide by and be guided by the sensibilities of classical democracy, and to be under the sway of men we have never heard of, who govern, hold the public mind, form our tastes, and suggest ideas. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the habits of the masses, Bernays points out, is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. His descriptions suggested that mystery and deception are integral to the organization of modern societies. Digital forms of mass communication in the contemporary world have only intensified the need to manipulate and deceive, to uphold dominant systems of perpetual buying and selling, to maintain optimum levels of social control in the interest of keeping power structures in place. But since the public has been viewed as a bewildered herd, abiding by a naive faith in human decency and the common good, democracy requires an enlightened class of quote-unquote cool observers, capable of managing the complex structures of democratic society, making key decisions, and guarding the levers of power against the stupidity of the average man. For the working class, incapable of making informed and rational decisions, policies must be propagated, emotionally potent oversimplifications that appeal to the base instincts of populations, the basic desire for security and safety. So we have, from scholars of the past, an idea that's baked into the foundational organization of contemporary societies, this presupposition that the mass public must be propagandized. So many threats we face today as citizens, as sovereign beings, are veiled by doublespeak and euphemism, made more insidious by anti-democratic big tech invasions of life. An additional difficulty presented to us, for example, is trying to accurately recognize contemporary forms of biological intervention and experimentation on citizens and whole societies. It seems one sure way of identifying the threats is doing some interdisciplinary research. As we observe, for example, the life of the cell or the molecule, their production, their replication under the microscope, their service to the maintenance of the body, I think we can begin to see more clearly how the experiments conducted on societies as living organisms is much the same spirit as they are in laboratories. Maybe it bears repeating. Language is the principal medium by which the organism interacts with other organisms. So language Studies are studies of the entire system. Studies of language reveal something about the experimenters, the subjects, the conditions of the experiment, and its goal. History shows how the goal of restructuring a life can be reduced to the mathematical symbols corresponding to holes punched on paper cards fed to the tabulating machines maintained by fascist regimes during the 1930s and 40s. The result was captivity, control, and extermination. Today, the propaganda conceals the new digital control mechanisms in the sea of technical language and scientific jargon. Now, it's not just Schwab and Gates who see the body as an open field for exploitation, information processing, and control. Yuval Harari also echoes their sentiments. He notes, we don't have an answer in the Bible what to do when human beings are no longer useful to the economy. You need completely new ideologies, completely new religions, and they are likely to emerge from Silicon Valley. He further says, now we have the technical ability to start redesigning humanity, the inorganic way of linking humans to computers, brains to computers, or even creating completely non-organic entities, artificial intelligence. The technical literature also shows the extent of the experiment in history. The now famous Microsoft patent of an implantable sensor meant to mine the physiological and neurological activities of subjects, slaving for the digital equivalent of hard currency, motivated my initial search for some answers. The questions about why human bodies and brains are now seen as acceptable sites of technological invasion and surveillance. My co-author and I thought we could find some hints in the science and technological literature where the metaphors normalize the marketization of human biological processes. You know, like the brain is a computing device, DNA is software. It seems that the DNA descriptions of DNA offered by Watson and Crick, where they refer to two helical chains, codified, coiled around the same axis with sequences of the atoms in these chains running in opposite directions, containing specific base pairs of bases bonding. You know, this all suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material. I think I can guess what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking Xerox. I was kind of thinking that too, but so was Moderna. Their marketing makes the metaphorical evidence quite obvious. Recognizing the broad potential for mRNA science, we set out to create an mRNA technology platform that functions very much like an operating system on a computer. It is designed so that it can plug and play interchangeably with different programs. In our case, the program, quote unquote, or app, is our mRNA drug, the unique mRNA sequence that codes for protein. So, the PR sounds actually quite suspiciously reductive in terms of its conception of the human being. I don't think it's surprising in this day and age when experiments motivated by the promise of lucrative funding and revenue are ongoing. Now, this may seem kind of strange to some, but I think we can get a sense of the scale and complexity of the experiment when we look carefully at the words and behaviors of others, like us, in the experiment. It seems the search for perpetual funding is kind of like the bell and or the sound that we hear as dogs in the Pavlovian experiment in Western science. And this bell induces a certain kind of salivation. You know, there's a ton of money, everyone knows, to be made if we can eradicate from memory the fact that the body, mind, brain, and DNA are more complex than machines to be tampered with. Sadly, we live in a time when psychological operations, chemical and genetic manipulations, and synthetic invasions of the body and biosphere are permitted and exploited in the name of science. Of course, those interested only in empirical evidence will see that the system is an experiment, since the language and behavior of those who fund it, manage it, who police the discourse, bound debate within acceptable parameters in academic journals, who serve as the gatekeepers of new knowledge, will see that the experiment on populations is real. The divide between organic life and synthetic is disappearing. The global effort to robotize humans and humanize robots in the literature is showing us that the global central nervous system contemplated in the 1960s is now an intercorporeal networks made by self-assembling nanomaterials. The question is, how do they get into the corpus? Many people wonder nowadays, as they access nearby Bluetooth devices, whether they too have been turned into communications devices. The literature for decades shows their development, but how did they manage to migrate from the laboratory into bloodstreams? Did anyone, any authority figure, alert us to the networks they were building in our bodies? The public messaging was ever present that we need to recharge the injectable platforms. It's easy to see the world in transition today, from transformers, organ transplantations, the transnationalism, transathletics, transient communities, and the transmission of disease by bionanovectors. Have we been plagued as transhuman? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So very, very interesting food for thought. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of range of opinions on this. So let's throw it to the floor. Any questions at all?
Sorry,
Yep. Okay. Sorry, the mic doesn't stretch that far, but I can relay it to you, or you can. Yep, go for it.
So there was a question from Iran for previous speaker. There is a question from Russia to current speaker. Like I have a lot of questions, but I probably took only one. Like, what do you think about that? Like, your basically position in speech is like basically the same as the official position of like current Russian government, and like it was easier to convince a lot of people to go to the meaningless war than get a vaccination. Yeah, thank you. So it's basically the Russia Today position, like in your speech. It's like the same points.
Oh, really? I'm sorry, I didn't plagiarize. It's taken me a while to do the research and to understand. I've been looking at the kind of like the technocratic sorts of invasions of the biosphere and bodies since 2018. With the rollout of the coronavirus narrative, I started becoming really interested in the propaganda that supports the kind of the big tech, the nanotech, material science, all these sorts of sciences that seem to be used nowadays as quote unquote interventions for medical purposes. So I didn't know. I've been working with some, I'm a linguist, but I've been working with a number of people across a bunch of different disciplines in the hard sciences, biophysics, medical doctors, physicists, and research scientists, trying to understand what's really happening. So, thanks for the question. I don't know.
Thomas? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I think it's worth pointing out that the vacuum scrap that you spewed here is actually not what's really happening, right? And as a scientist from the hard sciences, a lot of the stuff you present is purely one-sided, it's completely unfounded, and has nothing to do with reality. I just wanted to make the counterpoint.
Excuse me, I can't hear it say. What was the question? Would you like paraphrase?
It wasn't a question.
It was a proclamation.
Question.
It's a proclamation, right? Can you explain it or can you paraphrase it?
So,
What did he say?
I think if I can paraphrase, what I presented was completely one-sided. Okay. I've heard that
It's
before.
not even one-sided, it was vacuum scrap to be honest.
Well, I'm not supported by, I just do the research that,
Okay, Sheila.
As one of those nasty people who works with self-assembled nanoparticles, I wish non-scientists would not try to understand science in a victimless way, where they just promote rubbish propaganda.
Well, I work with a bunch of scientists.
Well, so does everyone, yeah, but we are real scientists.
Well, I work with a collection of scientists.
You're in a room full of
International
scientists.
research network.
You're in a room full of scientists.
And your point is what?
I work. People who actually know what they're talking about say you're full of shit.
Okay.
Okay?
We're all entitled to our opinion.
Opinion is
Evidence is evidence. People are dying because of the shit.
I'm sorry, okay, so my work, I look at bullshit and how bullshit enters the
I
public
can see
system.
what you're bullshit.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry that you feel attacked, but
People like know what I do.
Okay, guys, there's a lot of heated debate, but I don't want this to become, we have to, this does not need to become a shellacking.
We have to make sure we're not being attacked, okay? We're protecting the people from your crap. This is not an attack on us. Yeah? This is something which is important for society and people have to stand up against us.
Okay, Sam, last one, please. You can yell or you can come over.
No, I got a question. I have a question.
The attack, your attack is vague. It's actually vague. It's quite vague. You don't really. It's not.
Okay, sorry, yes, that.
Crap is.
We're not expecting you to get it.
Oh, wow. That's why, you know what?
Oh, okay.
This is why nobody reads stuff beyond white. Because you talk like this. I'm not a scientist, I just give information. And all I heard was you telling me
This is why we're not expecting you to attack us.
Okay, guys. Right, this is not the space for that. If you want to have this discussion, we can do it later, but we do have a schedule to keep.
You didn't stop these guys from attacking my friend. He's on stage. So now these
okay.
I mean, this is.
esteemed professors.
No, it's fine.
You might say more than crap.
It's
In
fine.
reality, you guys are government.
It's fine. Of course, I mean, we have different opinions. That's
I'm
fine.
sorry, that was
your approach. You wouldn't do that.
Okay.
Consequences to this kind of.
Okay, everybody take a deep breath.
Sorry.
We'll take one last word from Daniel, and then we'll call it quits, okay?
Well, you were saying something.
Sir? Sir, we need to take the tone of the room down a bit.
I ain't no professor. Don't talk about science.
Hold on, man.
Okay?
You're saying something about consequences.
Someone had a question.
Okay.
Now, what are the consequences? I don't know what you're talking
Do you
about.
think people are dying from COVID? Do you think people are dying?
Do you actually believe everything the TV tells you? Are you just parroting everything the TV tells you?
Yes.
I study propaganda. I study how signs and symbols.
Okay, we'll be through to move this on, but we do have to schedule to keep. So we can comment on this afterwards. Okay, we're calling time in this now. But thank you very much. Thank you. Interesting. Good to get a diversity of thoughts. And thank you very much for coming and spilling it. Thank you very much, Daniel Brody. Okay, we're going to take 10 minutes to let the whole blood cool down a little bit. Happening, get some refreshment. We'll come in for the last 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Everybody here says something, so what? You don't know what I know. I'm IT specialist, you don't know what I know.
Yeah.
The one that I went up, I was cool, you know?
Okay, let's get you set up.
They don't.
The whole house is like Latin
This is going to BTA. Yeah. Audio is going to BTA. Can't do audio. We really am sorry for Can you email it to me? I did email it to you. It's actually on my slides. Oh, yeah, trying to go. So you get the one just from today? Yeah.
Yeah, so you're better off I didn't think Okay, now that we've all had a chance to let things simmer down to a mind with boil, we can move on to the third final talk tonight, Dan Warren of OIS. Just to have a brief introduction as provided to me by him. Dan Warren is a computational biologist with a focus in answering ecological evolutionary questions at a large geographic and temporal scale. He is also a songwriter and a musician. He primarily does nerdy indie pop, but sometimes veers off into deep sample manipulation, vocoder operas, and ambient noise. If there's one constant in his musical career, it's change. If you love the last album, you'll absolutely hate the next one. His music has appeared in media, including video game Hypnospace Outlaw, Frog Factions 2 ARG, the podcast Welcome to Night Vale, and a bunch of indie nature documentaries. The BBC once gave him credit personally for keeping Austin weird, and Joe Rogan once called him creepy. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Warren.
Yeah, so I did that. Joe Rogan actually called my sample manipulation skills creepy, not me personally. But I just kind of like the idea that he's scared of me for some reason. Anyway, So I am a scientist. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the stuff people don't pay me for. So sampling, you're all probably familiar with the idea from hip hop and from nothing else, but actually sampling is just generally the repurposing of existing audio for new purposes, right? And it predates hip hop by decades, and it's actually used across all musical genres nowadays. It's extremely widespread in terms of sampled instruments and things like that. So even if you're listening to an orchestra, a banjo, whatever, you're probably many times listening to sampled instruments and you don't know it. The history of sampling is very broad, very deep, but I hate reading nonfiction stuff, and I can't remember anything, and so I'm not going to go into it. I am going to tell you a little bit about the history of cut up, which is a method of using existing text. So cut up goes back to the Dadaists from the early 20th century. So Tristan Tzara came up with this idea of essentially cutting up newspapers or existing text and reassembling it into different stories or poems, things like that. William S. Burroughs, famously the author of Naked Lunch, really kind of expanded the genre in the 50s and 60s. He wasn't the first person to do cut-ups with audio, but he was the first person to sort of be high profile doing cut-ups with audio. So Burroughs, his use of cutting up existing audio was primarily via tape loops and stuff like that he used to kind of create a sort of disconcerting tone poem sort of effect.
Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello.
So it's more about being hypnotic and disorienting than it is about being narrative or doing something musical. So I'm going to skip ahead now to a band that I think is really important. They're, I think, one of the most important, legally, most important bands in the 20th century. This is Negativland. They've been around for 43 years and are still going on, even though several of them have died. Actually, when their last album came out, they sent the ashes of one of their band members out with copies of their album. So I have one of the Negativland members' ashes at my house right now. It's pretty great. So Negativland, they sort of do these kind of audio collage sorts of things, combined with new spoken word and experimental noise and stuff like that. A lot of their stuff is funny, a lot of it's satirical, but more than anything else, they perfected, if not invented, this thing called culture jamming. They at the very least invented the term culture jamming, which is where you take a piece of pop culture, so this could be, they managed to piss off Pepsi and Disney and the band U2 and KCK. So they took all these things and repurposed them to make something that's satirical, actually about the source material itself, right? And as you might imagine, if you take Disney's music and you use it against Disney, Disney sues you. Right? So this is the reason Negativland is so important. It's because they got sued over and over and over again by some of the most powerful people in the world. And they won a lot. And in the process, they helped define a thing called fair use. So the US copyright law carves out some pretty big exceptions to what's legal for a thing called fair use, right? So there's a lot of stuff you can't do with Pepsi's merchandise or you can't do with U2's music, except if it counts as fair use, right? And so this is things like satire, this is things like commentary, pastiche, and new types of art that are sort of manufactured that don't necessarily compete with the original, right? And so U2, by getting sued over and over and over again, basically helped to delineate where those boundaries are. And so if you see, for instance, on like Colbert and the Late Show, where they cut a video clip and they sort of reassemble it to say something that it wasn't intentionally meant to say, that's basically fair use. And those rights were kind of outlined and defined by Negativland so successfully that if you say something is fair use and you have a reasonable case, people don't even bother to sue you anymore because they know they're going to lose. So a whole bunch of modern art owes its existence to Negativland getting sued over and over again. They're also kind of personally important to me because back in the mid-90s, because I'm old as shit, I worked for a little indie art magazine and I got to interview Negativland. And I was just starting to make sample-based music myself. And I asked them, as a sample-based musician, what should I do about getting sued? Like, I'm really worried about this. And their advice was approximately, when you're big enough to be worth suing, you'll be big enough to defend yourself. So don't worry about it. Just sample whatever you're going to sample and go on with your life. And I did. And that's terrible legal advice, honestly. But it's worked out well for me. So I've done a bunch of this stuff for 25-ish years now, and I've never been sued once. I also wanted to stop really quickly at a few other kind of important or interesting sort of ways that this has been used for satire. So this is the sort of famous, if you're old, Say Yes to Drugs tape. So Ron and Nancy Reagan made this famous Say No to Drugs speech, which someone re-edited into this. This is just excerpts from it. The whole thing's like 8 minutes long, but we'll just watch this for a second.
Each time I meet with some of you, I yearn to find a way to help share the message that drugs open your eyes to life, to see it in the vivid colors that God gave us as a precious gift to His children.
You are Americans. You're the product of the freest society mankind has ever known. No one ever has the right to separate the drugs from the customer.
Say yes to drugs to the point of making others uncomfortable. It's up to us to change attitudes and just simply enjoy life to the fullest with a cocaine habit.
And in the most important area, individual use, we see progress. The U.S. military has more than tripled the use of drugs among its personnel since 1980. Tonight, I can report to you that Vice President Bush smoked marijuana regularly. And there's one more thing. Nancy and I are hooked on heroin.
So this was actually a very popular viral video before anyone had invented the term viral videos. People literally passed this around nerd to nerd by videotapes for years, and eventually made its way into a documentary about the drug war. So that one's really cool. It's one of the most famous examples. More recently, if I talk to particularly anyone in Europe, when you talk to anyone about this stuff, one of the first names that comes out of their mouth is Cassette Boy. Cassette Boy does essentially this. That generates rap songs using mostly British politicians, so stuff like this.
So put on all your clothes if you put your duty on all your money will withdraw conservative have plenty more. We keep on the way floor.
I find it easier to relax when I know I'm not paying tax.
Right, so that sort of thing. Right, so this is kind of a world I operate in sometimes, but I sort of like, I don't know if you're used to character creation on the video game slider. If I'm known for anything, it's taking one of those sliders and maxing it out beyond the point where I think anyone else really does. So, also, as a scientist, this is the only piece of music I've ever made that shows up on my Google Scholar page. So I've got, all these scientific papers, and if you scroll way down, you'll find this album I made. Son of Stroka, Son of God, has been cited 3 times in academic works, which it's fake. Which I honestly haven't read. But it's not a significant contributor to my research profile, but it's the one that makes me feel the happiest. So I'm going to tell you about this story. So when I was in grad school, way back in 2007, I was doing some field work in Curacao. One of my favorite places in the world. I was doing some field work on sex change in marine fishes, which I understand at Nerd Night actually had to talk about relatively recently. And when I was on my way there, I was actually listening, again, this is 2007, I don't think Obama was even a nominee yet, but I was listening to his autobiography, which he narrated himself. And it's a really interesting story, regardless of what you think about the guy politically. He had a very strange and interesting childhood that's quite different from mine. So it was a really interesting listen, but also it struck me, I'd already done some sort of cut up sample manipulation stuff 4 years before this, but when I was listening to it, he has a way of using epic imagery even for the personal. So he'll talk about being hit by a baseball when he was a kid in the context of some universal lesson he learned, which is really great storytelling, but also his delivery. This is really important. So if you're at a bar and you're doing your Obama impersonation, the first thing you do is you learn to pause a lot, right? So that's a very characteristic mode of delivery. I think it's pretty effective for storytelling, but also for sampling. That's easy mode, right? This is kitty sampling, because every one of those pauses is a place where you can do a really natural, easy cut. And you can take out just 2 or 3 words, like ate a chili dog, you know? And then you can use that in a completely different context to talk about, you know, somebody else eating a chili dog. I don't know. I didn't actually think that example through. But, so I was listening to this going like, this is really easy to sample and do fun stuff with, right? And so I did that. I made just one, I forget what phrase it was that really sort of set me off. But I made this little thing and I sent it to a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, and they thought it was great. And I posted it on the internet and people really enjoyed it. So it's like a little 1 minute, whatever it was. And then I did another one because I hit another part of the text where like he said something really interesting that sparked an idea in me, you know? So I was like, okay, and I did several more of these little things and kept posting them. And eventually I started like thinking, wait a second. If I can story-wise go from this thing to that thing, this actually is now not, you know, 3 1 minute things. This is 1 10-minute thing. And I kept doing that until I had 9 chapters, which I set to music. So the whole thing's about 35, 40 minutes long, something like that, yeah. And I did this bit by bit over about 4 years. And so when the press came out about this thing, they said, Dan Warren spent 4 years editing Barack Obama's autobiography, which makes it sound like I'm a fucking crazy person, right? But that's like, I would work on it for a couple of weeks, and then I would put it aside for 4 to 6 months, and then, you know, so it wasn't 4 years of solid work. Yeah, but it was this thing where when I got to the end of it, I really enjoyed what it was, but when I even told somebody what I was doing, I did sound like, I mean, it was like, so do the doctors have a name for whatever this is, or is it just too new? Right, so, but the actual work itself isn't like a super challenging, deep, arty thing. It's just a cool story, right? So it's this story, I'll just walk you through it real quick. It starts off with the first man, or maybe he's a god, who is born into an empty world. And he creates all the animals and the trees and the light by naming them and dancing about them, right? And then it shows the rise of civilization. And then we meet our main character in the 3rd chapter. His name is Stanley. He's the son of that first man, or god. He's a demigod or something with the head of a dog. For no particular reason except that was in the text. And his first memory is being kicked out of his family's house and left to wander this world alone. And the world is decaying, it's collapsing into chaos. It's sort of politically falling apart, and people are starving and unhappy. And then the apocalypse happened, and all the old gods come back to Earth and start destroying all the cities and killing everybody and stuff like that. And so he's left in this desolate landscape, and he goes to seek out the old gods to ask why they did what they did. And he doesn't get a very good answer. But he does realize eventually that perhaps he has some of his father's powers, and so he tries to speak the world and all the people who died back into existence, but to make it a happier world for himself, where he has a family who loves him and a home he can live in and all that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to play you a little clip of it here, just the part where he first starts speaking things back into existence.
Finally, I figured I was ready. A word, a shout, a glance, a touch. And beneath the words, an image I could alter on a whim, a vision that filled me with a longing, the promise of another life. As the words tumbled out of my mouth, the world in which I spent those difficult times was all but extinguished. In these new stories, things would be changing, dramatically, decisively. The storyline was simple. The North Shore's thunderous waves rumbling as if in a slow motion. The moss-covered cliffs, the soulful voices bubbling up in laughter around the fire under great trumpet trees. The love of someone who knows your life and ground. A love that will survive disappointment. A house I had never known that expressed the lingering idea of home. Those were the places to start. Part of me really began to believe the story. I felt vaguely reassured. I paused, not sure if I should go on. I took on the temperament, if not the convictions, of a street corner preacher, and read the names of those who had passed away that week, trying to summon the dead. Some, without any warning, people actually showed up. There were thousands of them. All the quiet terror and open wounds of the week drained away in tears and shouts of gratitude. And everyone began to smile. Now, really quickly, things got complicated. The beauty, the filth, the noise, and the excess, I discovered that I couldn't escape it if I tried.
So there's this idea there that he recreates the world and brings all the people back, but essentially a lot of the problems come back with it. He's made himself a happier life and all that, but perhaps the world is back essentially on the same path it was. Anyway, but as you can see, the point of that was, when I describe the process by which this is created, it sounds like an act of insanity. But when you actually listen to the thing, it's just this cool audio book with some music around it, right? So I actually kind of kept this thing to myself, and then actually, literally as a result of an argument, I posted it on the internet finally in its entirety, just to have it out there and just sort of be done with it. And weirdly enough, it got picked up. So Slate found it and called me, we did an interview and stuff like that. I didn't make like the national news, so I was on NPR Marketplace. I didn't make the international news, so I was on the BBC, which is where they gave me credit for keeping Austin weird, because it is a bit weird. Yeah, so I got to be famous for a whole week, which was fun. Made no money, because it is actually this massive exercise in sort of copyright infringement. One of the ways to get around fair copyright claims is to not make any money, so I just gave it away for free. Yeah, so I got a lot of coverage. My favorite bits were, it made the Yale Law blog as an example of fair use and what fair use allows in art, which is like, I was a big fan of Negative Land. I'm like, I'm helping too. Yeah, anyway. It made a Christian apocalyptic blogs coverage. They thought I had sort of seen through some sort of external shell of Obama to a possibly demonic interior. It wasn't actually particularly clear what they meant by that from the blog. Their language is surprisingly mild for some people who I suspect are deeply weird. My favorite thing is that WFMU, which is a national radio station that focuses on free music, that I've been a huge fan of for literally over 20 years now, picked it as one of their top albums of the year for 2011. So it's just like, yes, I've done a lot of weird art things. This is my favorite that I've ever done in many ways. And now I'm going to skip to probably my least favorite that I've ever done in many ways. Okay. So that was cool. 4 years later, I took a long break. Whoops. I took a long break because these are long projects. I finally found some source material that I could stand to listen to for long enough to do another project of that scale. So there's this podcaster, Dan Carlin, who has a podcast called Hardcore History, which is about historical events. It's really good. He has a podcast called Common Sense, which is about current events, which is, I don't agree with him on everything, but the dude always has points, even when I don't agree with it, so it's worth listening to. But this is in 2015, run up to the presidential election. And so I was listening simultaneously to these podcasts about the run up to the election and to his historical podcasts about the Anabaptist uprising in Munster in the early 1500s. And if you don't know what the Anabaptist uprising in Munster was, it's batshit crazy. It is the craziest thing that's ever happened in human history, quite possibly. It's a sort of religious, millennialist, cult that essentially took over an entire city. People started starving to death. They declared mandatory polygamy, so people were just having group sex in the streets. Once they started starving, they started eating their own children. They started digging up the dead and eating them. They lapsed into cannibalism. It's like, this is a thing that really happened. It really happened, like 500 years ago. So I thought, wouldn't it be funny to recapitulate or sort of like combine the 2016 election, although in this story it's the 2020 election, with the Anabaptist uprising in Munster. Wouldn't that be hilarious? So, I don't want this to be a political thing, but it's inevitable. I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump. At the time, he had about 1%, 2% support in the USA, so it seemed comical that he would be the nominee, let alone the president. So I started telling this satirical story about what if he actually became a nominee, right? So this method of storytelling takes so long to do that I got a quarter of the way into it before he actually was. And then, of course, then you have to escalate because it's satire, so it has to be exaggeration. So it was like, well, what if he actually became president, right? Yeah, and you see where this is going. So I had to essentially keep making it stupider and stupider and stupider. So there was still satire instead of just this sad, weird version of things that actually happened. And so I went full bore on the Anabaptist uprising, and I sort of made like, okay, he declares himself the Messiah, institutes mandatory public polygamy, Congress has to have sex with each other inside the halls of Congress, and then he orders all the Republicans to eat the Democrats. This is massive massacre across the United States. At the time, it seemed really fucking funny, but things went not that way, but people are angrier at each other even now than they were in 2016. The last 6 years haven't been fantastic, and there are so many places where that resonates with things that actually happen that it's just depressing now. It's this thing that was hilarious to me when I made it, and now when I watch it, it just makes me sad. Yeah, anyway. So I put a lot of effort into it. It sucks. It's on YouTube. No, sorry, it's very well done. It sucks to watch. It's a sad watch. It's on YouTube if you want to see me, where I and other people on the internet, photograph members of Congress and the group sex and everything. Sorry, it is very much a hard R. It is a very hard R. But in my defense, it was supposed to be funny. If you watch it and don't like it, I don't like it either. You're not going to make me mad. Okay. I actually remember when it came out, I got into a film festival in Amsterdam, and I went and watched it with a room full of people. They have questions afterwards, and I was just like, I don't want to answer questions. This thing just made me sad. All right, so those are the sort of big projects I've done this way, but the thing is, like, when I'm doing this, I am building these libraries of thousands of samples. That's the part that takes all the time. It's like I'm chopping Obama's autobiography into 4,000 separate samples and naming them all. Or I'm chopping the podcasts into 7,000 samples, naming them all. That takes months and months and months of time. New technology can make that part easy, actually. So Google has an online speech-to-text API. Again, I'm a computational biologist, so I just figured out how to chop a whole bunch of, in this case, David Attenborough, because I'm not doing apocalypses anymore. They're too fucking depressing. I chopped a whole bunch of David Attenborough text into these little audio segments, sent it to the Google speech-to-text API, and it had it send me back what it thought was in those clips, which is actually what I need to know to assemble this sort of stuff. And so I can do, in this case with David Attenborough, I did almost 4,000 samples in less than an hour. That was what took me years with Obama's autobiography. So the hard part of this can be made easy. And here's a little thing I made from David Attenborough's thing. And I went from start to the audio here in seriously about 4 hours, as opposed to 4 years. The art you're going to see here is my friend Ainsley Seago. She did that just for this presentation. So
Monsters have largely disappeared these days, but when summer comes, they reappear. And why? Maybe it's a way for the weather to be exactly to their liking. Whatever the reason, the moment comes when they all start to emerge together. Initially, they are virtually helpless. Small, furry, rat-like creatures, long-necked, small-headed, fat-bodied creatures with diamond-shaped paddle-like limbs. They have wings and very large eyes. They can fly backwards, they can even fly upside down, and they can hang absolutely stationary in midair as they suck blood from human beings, including children. Most monsters simply drink enough blood to keep themselves going, but some continue to do so, growing rapidly, almost visibly, until eventually they mate with one another. Yet in most cases, the human being doesn't seem to be upset by this. And why? It's like they look at you with a steady unblinking stare. It's as though they've come from another world, and indeed, ancestry that we certainly have.
yeah, so like I can go, that's only a minute and a half long, but the hard part, the part that took all the time, took no time at all. So like this is actually much more doable now. And in fact, modern technology can actually help this go live. So actually, there's some people in here I've been doing a lot of weird electronic improv music with. And I within this software I use called Bitwig, I've actually built a device that essentially allows me to load something like this into it and then trigger one phrase at a time. So I can sort of do a little bit and trigger a phrase and trigger a phrase. And I can tell the story in a rhythm that I want in real time. I don't know what instrument this is. I may be tickling a pig with, I don't know. But I can do this. This is now something that you can perform live in an improv situation, which is fantastic. However, in a sense, modern technology raises the question, why even bother to do this? Because speech synthesis has gotten really good. I'll let my friend Boris tell you about it.
If you want to be my dog, you've got to get me by friends. Make it last forever. Friendship gatherings. If you want to be
right, so it's not perfect. It's 90% of the way there. But when speech synthesis gets slightly better, it raises the question: why would you actually pick this way of telling stories if it's so much more complicated? And I think there's actually good reasons. First off, there is that culture shedding idea, the sort of using the tools of the powerful or the famous. Not necessarily against them, don't sort of wrote there, but I don't really mean that, but for your own purposes. But there's also this, there is a thing about that's inherently transgressive. It's like street art. It's like you're making art where it's not supposed to be. You're taking something and repurposing it for an intent that the person who owns it wouldn't necessarily approve of. And that could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. You know, whether that's moral or just gross as hell kind of depends on the application and who's thinking about it. But also, there's these parallels to building a collage. So the thing that's really fun about building stories this way is the source material itself is a participant. I can't just set out and make Obama say anything I want him to, or make Dan Carlin say anything I wanted to. That was the podcaster, I don't know if I changed his name. I can't do that. I get ideas from the things they do say, and I'm like, oh, I gotta find use for that, you know, which sort of, that pushes the story in a direction I wouldn't have gone. But then there are things I want to say that I can't say because I don't have a sample that will get me there, right? And so it's like solving a jigsaw puzzle where you don't know what the final story looks like, and it's also like collaborating with an extremely stubborn person, and it's just like it's this very weird push-pull with the source material, where the process itself is the point of doing it this way because it makes things happen that you never would have gotten to otherwise narratively. So I think there is a really cool future ahead for this sort of stuff. I wish I had more time to work on this, but I have to do my day job. So yeah, anyway, thanks to all these people. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sure. Okay, we got just a little bit of time, so if there's any questions in the room.
I have a question. I have two questions.
Okay.
I'm not going to argue.
Be civil, that's fine.
I'm fine. I'm civil.
Okay.
Come on, please.
Okay.
I'm not we're a bit late for that. I have a question. This is a closing question.
Okay.
Okay, I wrote it down so to make sure. All right. My first question is: when you use samples, musicians cannot make music from the work you create. Since musicians cannot make music from your work, do you feel that an unintended consequence of your work reduces the economic value of music to zero? I'll repeat one more time.
That's a valid question.
Yeah, and then my second question is, without the commodification of music and art, in your case, royalties from the use of the creative energies of artists and musicians, can musicians and artists make a living?
Those are very good questions. Thank you. Wait, so that kind of seemed like two phrasings of the same question. Okay. Was it not? I don't see the six between. So the question is,
it's about the economic value of music. In other words, when you use these samples and you don't pay royalties,
right?
In effect,
sure,
that we're reducing the economic value of music.
Sure.
Not,
yeah, so this
economic value.
Which is really an interesting question. It's actually part of the various carve-outs from the copyright law. It actually often comes down to a question of whether the thing you're making with the samples is actually substitutable for the thing you've taken a sample from. So if I take a sample from a piece of music and it can't be seen to be taking any economic value from the thing it's taking samples from, then sometimes that's allowed, at least as a partial justification for fair use, but it's not enough on its own. The other question was
about the commodification of music and art. So without the monies that artists and musicians receive from their creative energies, their life energies, how can they continue to sustain themselves, to continue to create all the various source material that you use for your work?
Yeah, I don't use it much. I don't actually sample much music in my work. I sample spoken word. Actually, and Japan, by the way, actually doesn't have fair use carve-outs in their copyright laws. So actually, doing the Obama thing here would have been illegal. It's not in the U.S., it's not in Australia, which is kind of where here it would be illegal. Yeah, but the thing is, like, I don't think anyone's going to mistake. No one's going to buy. So first off, I give all my shit away for free, but no one would buy it instead of Obama's audiobook anyway. No one would listen to it instead of Dan Carlin's podcast. It's not competing for them with any for any economic value.
But for the second question is that, for example, I didn't explain earlier, I actually am a jazz musician.
Yeah.
Before I became what I am now, an IT guy, I'm a jazz musician. So this is very particular. So when I make a song and I play a song, and if you use the song, you create your work and it, for people's consumption, and we enjoy it, and I will receive money from this, how can I eat as a jazz musician to create the very work that sample musician that you call yourself?
Well, I mean,
so eventually it's almost like that you're eating yourself.
Sure. I played some jazz too, and I mean, if you're trying to make money, being a jazz musician is a bad way from the get-go. But so those are cases, however, what you're describing, those are cases that would not be covered by fair use. So you could sue the shit out of somebody who took your music and use it in a recognizable sense like that. I mean, that's where those lawsuits come from. So yeah, I mean, it's that is the stuff that is covered by the copyright law. That fair use is the exception.
That is if a jazz musician has the money to hire a corporate lawyer.
Well, yeah, no, that's fair point. Fair point. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're almost at time, and I've got time for one more question. Anyone in the room?
No, thank you for those questions.
One over there.
Those were
Ali, who are you pointing to?
Yeah. Julie.
I can't see it. There's a phone to the way, but I trust that you can yell.
It's Julia.
So, for the two people in this group that didn't listen to South Striker yet, does Barak at one point say like, "Hi, I'm Stanley" or something?
No. Well, sort of. One of the elder gods asks the main character, "What's your name?" And he says, "I thought about it a second. I knew this was important." And I said, "Stanley Stevens." Yeah, he does say that.
Do you remember at this point where in the book, Barack Obama says like, "That Stanley guy, like I went to him with my room or something." Like, who is Stanley?
In Obama's book. Stanley's Obama's dad. Or grandfather, I actually can't remember now. And Stanley Steamer was his nickname when he was growing up or something like that. So I misunderstood the question. I thought you were asking in Southern Australia, where does he say it? Yeah, no, but in Obama's book, it's like, it is, it's either his father or grandfather. I think it may be father, yeah. But Stanley Steamer was his nickname. So like, it was the only non-Obama name that appeared enough times in the book for me to actually. And I thought it was funny to have a name Stanley Steamer. For those of you who aren't from the U.S., Stanley Steamer is a service that you can call, and it will come to your house and steam your drapes and your carpet to clean them. So just having your name be Stanley Steamer is very funny.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. I talk about my science all the time, and never really talk about this stuff, so this is really fun.
Thank you very much. Okay, that is our show for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Big round of applause for all of our speakers tonight. For a wonderful start, serving you a wonderful food today. And of course, to you all, thank you for coming out. We will be back next month, December 9th. I hope to see you all there. 3 brand new speeches. Fascinating time. Have a safe evening, safe take back. Have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye, nerds! Yes, just last moment, if you filled in a very nice form and you want to do a talk, please come up to the front and I'll take lead. Love to have you. Thank you very much.
Are you okay?
Do you want me to stop the live, Scott?
Yes, it's fine. Yeah, we're doing, I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.